Ethan Cole had always believed silence was his father's favorite language. Growing up, he learned to read it, the way Robert's jaw tightened when Ethan mentioned his art, or how his eyes drifted away whenever the word love came up in a way that didn't fit the picture of what a son was supposed to be. To Robert, life had a structure, a spine of discipline that kept everything in place. Ethan, with his sketchbooks and restless heart, seemed like a misplaced page in that order. Even now, at 25, Ethan still carried that quiet weight of being misunderstood. The small town of Brookfield hadn't changed much since his teenage years. The same neat lawns, the same cautious smiles. He'd moved into a small apartment downtown after graduating from art school, hoping distance might finally give both him and his father room to breathe. But it hadn't. Robert's presence lingered, in his tone during their phone calls, in the way Ethan still hesitated before saying anything too personal. One late afternoon, Ethan visited his parents' house for dinner. Claire, his mother, greeted him with her warm, habitual smile, the kind that tried to smooth over whatever tension waited behind closed doors. Robert was already seated at the table, still in his principal's uniform, pressed shirt, tie knotted just so, authority hanging on him like a second skin. "How's work?" Robert asked without looking up. "It's good," Ethan said softly. "I've been doing more freelance projects lately." "Some clients from New York, that's nice," his father interrupted, slicing into his meat. "But you should think about something stable. Something that lasts." Ethan smiled thinly. "Art lasts, Dad." Robert's knife paused mid-cut, but he said nothing. The clinking of silverware filled the silence that followed. Claire's gentle hum of approval toward Ethan's artwork couldn't mask the distance stretching between father and son. They were two people who loved each other but never managed to speak the same emotional language. After dinner, Ethan lingered by the porch while his father read the newspaper. The air smelled faintly of rain, heavy and expectant. "I should go," Ethan said finally. Robert looked up, his expression unreadable. "Drive safe." It was their version of goodbye, brief, careful, and incomplete. Later that night, Ethan sat by his apartment window, his laptop open, the glow painting his tired face in soft blue. It was then he saw a new message notification flash across his screen. The name was unfamiliar. "Daniel Hayes, your art has a heartbeat," the message read. "Most people paint what they see. You paint what you feel." Ethan hesitated, curious. He clicked on Daniel's profile, minimal, discreet, the kind of person who didn't say much about himself but seemed to understand too much about others. Their first conversation was short, thoughtful, and strangely grounding. Daniel had a voice, even through text, that carried a kind of calm Ethan hadn't known in years. Over the next few weeks, their exchanges grew into long midnight conversations. Daniel asked questions that no one else ever did, not about technique or career, but about the why behind Ethan's art. "When you paint," Daniel once said, "you're not running from the world. You're just trying to make it honest again." It was a line that stayed with Ethan for days. There was something familiar about Daniel's phrasing, his mix of warmth and restraint. It reminded him, in an odd, uneasy way, of his father when he wasn't wearing his armor of authority. But Ethan brushed the thought aside. Daniel was different. He was someone who listened, someone who didn't flinch at softness. One Saturday evening, they finally met in person. A quiet cafe near the edge of town, far from curious eyes. Daniel was older than Ethan expected, early 30s, maybe mid-30s, with a presence that drew attention without trying. His smile was slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his tone carried a familiar steadiness that made Ethan's pulse falter for reasons he couldn't name. Their conversations in person were effortless, flowing like a melody both had memorized without realizing it. Daniel asked about Ethan's family. Ethan hesitated but answered honestly. "My dad and I, we see the world differently." Daniel nodded, thoughtful. "Fathers can be complicated men. Sometimes they mistake fear for love." The words landed heavier than expected. Ethan looked at him closely. "That's exactly what it feels like." "Then you understand him more than you think," Daniel said gently. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing, art, loneliness, the strange ache of being misunderstood. When Daniel reached across the table and brushed Ethan's hand, it felt both thrilling and terrifying. Not because of what it meant, but because it felt real in a way that demanded honesty. Weeks turned into months. Their bond deepened, though Daniel remained guarded. He never spoke much about his past or where he lived. His life seemed folded into shadows, private, but not dishonest, or so Ethan told himself. The secrecy, he believed, was just part of who Daniel was. One evening, as autumn crept in, Daniel showed up at Ethan's apartment unannounced. He looked tense, distracted, his usual composure frayed. "Rough day?" Ethan asked, closing his sketchbook. "Something like that," Daniel murmured, looking away. "Sometimes, I wish I could just disappear from everything I've built." Ethan touched his arm lightly. "Then stay here. Just for a while." Daniel smiled, grateful but distant, like someone carrying a truth he couldn't yet confess. As they sat together in silence, Ethan caught himself studying the way Daniel's brow furrowed when he thought deeply, the same way his father's did when lost in reflection. The resemblance was fleeting, almost absurd, but it left a strange chill crawling through his chest. Later that night, when Daniel left, Ethan sat in the quiet of his apartment, unable to shake the sense of something unspoken hovering between them. He opened his phone to reread old messages, scrolling through their early exchanges until one line caught his attention again, the one Daniel had written weeks ago: "When you paint, you're not running from the world. You're just trying to make it honest again." He remembered hearing almost the same sentence once before, years ago, from his father, a rare moment of tenderness after finding Ethan sketching under the kitchen light at midnight. Ethan stared at the message, his stomach tightening. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he was imagining things. But the echo of familiarity refused to fade. Outside, the rain began to fall, steady and unrelenting. The world beyond his window blurred into shifting shapes, reflections without edges. Inside, his thoughts did the same, forming questions he wasn't ready to ask. When Daniel's next message appeared on his screen, Ethan's breath caught. The words were simple, kind, and yet eerily familiar. Something his father had once said almost word for word: "Sometimes people only see what they're ready to understand." Ethan's fingers hovered above the keyboard, frozen. For the first time since their connection began, the warmth of Daniel's voice in his head was replaced by unease. Something deep inside him stirred, confusion, fear, and a flicker of recognition he wished he could ignore. The silence in his apartment grew heavier than before, pressing against him from every direction. He didn't reply. Not yet that he needed to understand what exactly he was feeling, and why Daniel's words sounded like ghosts from a life he thought he'd left behind, and somewhere between that thought and the echo of rain, a quiet dread began to take root. Ethan woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that he hadn't expected. The memory of his visit to Lucas's house lingered like a subtle fragrance, pleasant, unsettling, impossible to ignore. As he moved through the quiet of his apartment, the sunlight slanting through the blinds caught dust motes in a way that made the room feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. His thoughts circled Lucas, the intensity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the effortless way he seemed to understand truths that Ethan had spent years hiding from himself. Grace called later, her voice cheerful over the phone. "Breakfast at my place?" she asked. Ethan agreed, though he felt an odd dissonance between the familiarity of her invitation and the turbulence inside him. At breakfast, Grace noticed his distraction. "You've been quiet," she said, setting down her coffee. "Something on your mind?" Ethan forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just tired, I guess," he said. But he knew the explanation was thin. Thoughts of Lucas, the subtle tension, the connection, the moral complexity, occupied more space than he cared to admit. The day passed slowly. Messages from Lucas arrived intermittently, short and casual. "Hope your day is going well," one read. Ethan hesitated before replying, conscious of the delicate balance he was navigating between curiosity and propriety. He responded briefly, avoiding the temptation to dwell on the subtext of their interaction. Each notification felt like a pulse, reminding him that the story was not yet complete. Later in the week, Lucas unexpectedly appeared at Grace's house. Ethan's heart skipped, caught off guard by the presence that had already taken on more significance than he expected. Lucas greeted him with a nod, an acknowledgement that carried layers of meaning without words. Grace, unaware of the unspoken dynamics, chatted animatedly about her week, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Michael, who listened silently as always. Ethan noticed the subtle exchanges, glances, pauses in conversation, a hand lightly brushing the edge of a chair, that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. He realized that this was not about physical attraction, at least not in the conventional sense. It was about recognition, being seen in a way that required neither explanation nor justification. He felt a mixture of exhilaration and guilt, a complex cocktail of emotions that left him simultaneously energized and burdened. During lunch, Lucas leaned in slightly while discussing mundane topics, and Ethan caught himself absorbing every word, every inflection. The conversation drifted toward personal histories, family expectations, and the choices that define us. Lucas spoke candidly about his own struggles, the ways he had to conceal aspects of himself, and the quiet courage it required to live authentically. Ethan listened, recognizing reflections of his own internal conflicts. "You know," Lucas said softly, "sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering who you are, it's accepting it. Accepting it without fear, without shame." His words lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, striking chords within Ethan that he hadn't realized were still tender. Ethan felt compelled to respond, to articulate the truth he had kept locked away. Yet he paused, weighing the consequences, the familial ties, the delicate morality of the situation. In that pause, he realized something crucial: this wasn't about temptation or betrayal. It was about reflection, acknowledgement, and understanding. After the lunch concluded, Lucas stayed behind for a moment to speak privately. "Ethan," he said, his tone gentle, "you don't have to respond in any particular way. Just know that honesty, with yourself first, matters more than any expectation." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. Ethan nodded, feeling the quiet gravity of the moment, recognizing that this exchange was a turning point, a subtle but profound shift in his consciousness. As Lucas left, the air in the house seemed to settle differently. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and tension, a sense that something important had occurred without dramatic action or overt confession. He understood that this was not the conclusion of the story but the beginning of an inner journey, one that would require reflection, courage, and perhaps even confrontation with truths he had long ignored. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his room, replaying the events of the week. He thought about Grace, about Michael, about the unspoken rules of family and society. He also thought about Lucas, about the rare clarity and acknowledgement he had received, the mirror held up to his own suppressed identity. The realization was profound: connections do not always need to manifest in grand gestures. Sometimes, a quiet understanding, a shared glance, or a single sentence can redefine perspectives, priorities, and desires. Ethan wrote in his journal, carefully choosing words that allowed him to explore emotions without judgment. He reflected on guilt, curiosity, and authenticity, recognizing the necessity of separating impulse from insight. The visit to Lucas's home, the conversations, the subtle tension, all had been catalysts for something greater, a confrontation with the self, with truths that had long been buried beneath routine, expectation, and fear. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lucas maintained a cautious distance, their interactions brief but meaningful. Each message, each meeting, each conversation carried layers of significance, building a quiet narrative of understanding rather than action. Ethan discovered that the value of these moments lay not in what was done, but in what was recognized, acknowledged, and held in confidence. By the end of the week, Ethan realized he had changed in subtle yet undeniable ways. He was more attuned to his emotions, more aware of the boundaries between desire and morality, connection and complication. He had learned that human relationships are rarely simple, that honesty with oneself is a form of courage, and that understanding does not always require action. It can exist quietly, shaping decisions, thoughts, and future paths. As he prepared for another weekend visit to Grace's house, Ethan felt a sense of calm tempered by anticipation. He knew that the story with Lucas was not a tale of dramatic conflict or overt scandal. Instead, it was a story of recognition, self-reflection, and the delicate dance of morality and human connection. It ended not with resolution, but with clarity, a bittersweet acceptance of complexity. Ethan understood one final truth: life rarely offers answers in neat packages. Some of the most profound experiences are those that leave questions lingering, allowing reflection, growth, and understanding to flourish quietly in their wake. And in that quiet space, he felt both awakened and prepared, for whatever challenges, connections, or revelations might lie ahead. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. The ache in his stomach had dulled into a persistent, low thrum, but his chest remained heavy with anticipation. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. Julian had returned from work earlier, and now, as Ethan watched him moving about the kitchen, every small gesture seemed magnified, each shift of weight, the tilt of his head, the soft sigh as he set down a glass. Ethan's mind raced, each thought pulling him closer to the confrontation he had been dreading all day. That he took a deep breath and called Julian's name, steadying his voice. "Julian, can we talk?" The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Julian paused mid-motion, the smile that had lingered on his lips faltering slightly. He turned, leaning against the counter, curiosity and unease flickering in his eyes. "Of course," he replied, voice calm, though not entirely free of tension. Ethan motioned toward the living room, and they sat across from each other, the distance between them charged with unspoken truths. He searched Julian's face, reading the subtle cues he had learned to trust over the years, the slight furrow of the brow, the hesitation before speaking, the avoidance of direct eye contact. Ethan's own pulse quickened. He had rehearsed countless scenarios in his mind, but now, faced with the reality, he realized that no amount of preparation could ease the intensity of this moment. "I know something's been going on," Ethan began, keeping his tone even, measured. "I don't want to accuse you without reason, but I've seen things, messages, behavior, that I can't ignore." He paused, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "I need the truth, Julian. I can't keep wondering anymore." Julian's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then he exhaled, a quiet sound that seemed to carry months of hidden tension. "Ethan, you're right," he admitted, voice low and tinged with regret. "I haven't been honest with you. I made a mistake. It was brief, but it happened, and I didn't know how to tell you." Ethan's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and heartache washing over him. The words confirmed the suspicions that had plagued him for weeks, yet hearing them spoken aloud made the pain undeniably real. He leaned back slightly, trying to process the revelation. "Why, Julian? Why now?" His voice was quieter, almost fragile, carrying the weight of hurt tempered by a desire to understand. Julian shifted, gaze dropping to his hands. "I felt lonely, Ethan. I thought I could handle it, that it wouldn't hurt us, but I was wrong. I let my insecurities and frustrations guide me, and I didn't consider the consequences for us, or for you." His voice cracked, an unguarded vulnerability spilling through the facade of composure. Ethan studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in Julian's tone against the betrayal of trust. He felt anger, yes, sharp and biting, but it was intertwined with lingering affection, the memories of shared laughter, quiet nights, and tender moments that had defined their relationship. The ache in his chest mirrored the ache in his stomach from earlier, both physical and emotional, a reminder that his body had been responding to truths he could no longer avoid. "I appreciate your honesty," Ethan said finally, voice steadying. "But honesty doesn't erase what happened. I need time, to think, to process, to decide what this means for us. I can't just move past it." Julian nodded, understanding the gravity of the statement. He reached out tentatively, but Ethan held up a hand, a gentle boundary. "I need space tonight," Ethan continued. "Not to push you away, but to protect myself. I need to feel whole again, to separate my love for you from the hurt you caused." Julian's shoulders slumped slightly, and he exhaled, the tension in his body easing just enough to acknowledge acceptance. "I understand," he said softly, voice full of remorse. Ethan remained on the couch, alone for a few minutes, letting the quiet envelop him. The city outside shifted to deeper tones of night, lights flickering like distant constellations. He reflected on the events of the past weeks, the subtle signs he had ignored, the anxiety that had manifested physically, the creeping suspicion that had become impossible to deny. He realized that this confrontation, though painful, had been necessary. The truth, however difficult, was a prerequisite for healing, and for reclaiming control over his own life and emotions. Later, Julian returned to the living room, sitting at a respectful distance. They spoke cautiously, choosing words with care. There was no shouting, no blaming, only acknowledgement of mistakes and tentative steps toward understanding. Julian expressed regret repeatedly, his sincerity evident in the quiet tone and measured gestures. Ethan listened, allowing himself to absorb the remorse while maintaining his own sense of self. As the night wore on, Ethan felt the ache in his stomach finally begin to subside, replaced by a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The physical discomfort had mirrored the emotional turmoil, and now, with truths laid bare, the tension within him eased incrementally. He realized that forgiveness, if it came at all, would not be immediate. Trust, once fractured, required time and careful reconstruction. Ethan finally rose from the couch, moving toward the window to gaze at the city below. The neon lights shimmered on wet streets, reflections dancing in puddles like fragments of memory and hope. Julian remained behind, silent, watching him, both aware that the night had marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer enveloped in uncertainty, yet the path ahead was undefined, a delicate balance between reconciliation and self-preservation. Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Willis, follow-up appointment confirmed, tests ready for review. A reminder that physical health, like emotional health, required attention, vigilance, and care. Ethan smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and determination washing over him. Whatever lay ahead, whether reconciliation with Julian or a journey apart, he would face it with awareness, strength, and a renewed understanding of his own boundaries. As he sat by the window, breathing in the cool night air, Ethan acknowledged a simple truth: endings and beginnings often intertwined, and clarity, even when painful, was preferable to lingering doubt. The night had delivered harsh truths, but it had also offered the possibility of growth, healing, and self-discovery. With that knowledge, he allowed himself a small measure of peace, knowing that tomorrow, the story of his life, and his heart, would continue to unfold, one deliberate step at a time.